And they asked, why doesn't equal pay for equal work help women? Why are women given the worst paid jobs? Why do their trade unions fight for the family man, but not the working woman? So we not have family too? You hear the profound gap between the law on the books and the law in reality, in what Professor Eugene Barreto names as an unjust gender system, with an unequal distribution of and access to material resources and power. Professors Elsa Leoraini and Marlene Hamilton, using data from the 1970s, looked at professional women, and they found although the ratio of professional women increased significantly, the sex role discrimination did not decrease. When you listen to the concerns raised by the women in Sweet Sugar Ridge, you may be tempted to ask, did the manly lawmaking initiatives in the 70s move us forward? Among other things, we've heard about maternity leave legislation, equal pay for equal work, the establishment of a family court. I'm particularly interested in the status of children legislation. I think it was extraordinary valuable work that the law work of the Manley administrations developed a notion of decolonial justice that had value then and still has value now and has regrettably been largely lost. I can't think of any other Caribbean prime minister that achieved as wide-ranging law reforms aimed at the working class and aimed at women as Smoddy. Rex Nettleford refers to this law work as Smodditization, with a growing self-confidence and awareness amongst the vast majority of Jamaican people. Through social legislation, interestingly, Michael Manley's lawmaking usefully unsettled some of the tenets of the status quo constitution that his own father had helped to produce in 1962 for Jamaica, in which an attachment to English law was described as the loyalty of common sense by Norman Manley. This constitution, Gloria Comper, one of the earliest black women lawyers in Jamaica, explained was tailored to preserve the colonial status quo. That meant the inclusion of restrictive savings law clauses that protected laws that had been historically treated women as unequal and as less than. Sex and gender were not included in the 1962 Constitution as prohibited grounds of discrimination. It meant in 1962 making women second-class citizens with unequal rights to convey their citizenship to other family members. And then our decolonization constitution entrenched that legal and social status quo, not just through savings law clauses, but through the levels of entrenchment, as the Bahamas has brutally seen with 2 failed referenda. The 1962 Constitution never mentioned the words dignity and equality as foundations, but both were imperfectly but vividly part of the Smodditization, women and the law work of the Michael Manley governments. And as we've heard throughout, they empowered several women to participate in seeking social change. Decolonial justice overlaps a little bit for me with Sandra Fredman's idea of substantive equality. The idea here is that law change and reformed law should play a role in addressing past disadvantage, and particularly past colonial disadvantage. They must accommodate difference and structural change and facilitate structural change. They must enable social inclusion and provide a space for the political voice of those disempowered. And they must redress stigma and humiliation, the sort Miss Iris described. The Manley era laws did some of this. Not entirely. Some of the laws were tied to notions of equal treatment or formal equality, which often doesn't take enough of an account of gender disadvantages. Laws like the Status of Children legislation were as much about formalizing equal rights for fathers and parents as they were about legitimizing children. And that approach has created severe gender wars in our courts as poor men and women fight over custody and child support, leveraging these equal rights as parents, both to contest and affirm gendered power. and as tools to punish one another and demand respect in gender relations in a family law system that actually gives them very little economic and material support. I think the question to ask is not simply what was achieved in the 70s or not. I think the question we have to ask is what of our own stewardship in the 4 decades since. Gender justice is not a destination, it's an ongoing project. This is a key point of Dion Jackson Miller's academic work, which says justice is a journey. It begins with the creation of an ideal, and it's followed by the development of a roadmap. She argues that perfect justice can never be achieved, but the efforts at doing so must be unceasing. Jamaica, which led the Caribbean in the 1970s in the enactment of social legislation to advance gender justice, now lags behind our large and small neighbors on virtually every single legal index. Key reforms to family property, for example, I think of Khadijah's last comments, have left countless women behind. Status of children legislation gave children rights of access to fathers' estates, but didn't give the mothers of those children and partners of those men an interest until many decades later. Instead of dismantling gender expectations that formed part of our unjust colonial status quo, we now house those gender values and gender anxieties in sticky colonial laws like the Offenses Against the Persons Act of 1864. Instead of rethinking those laws, revising those laws, we have doubled down on them, indigenized them, entrenched those colonial frames. Or 2011, and I'm seeing the time, Maziki, or 2011 constitutional reforms with a new charter, which for the first time expressed the idea that we're all equal under the law and have a right to family life, then said just not the laws dealing with sexual offenses or abortion or indecent speech, a reincarnation of the very heavily criticized savings law clauses, except this time angled on certain bodies, women's bodies, queer bodies. This is a strong and articulate repudiation of the notion that women are smutty, a plain insistence that some don't have the right to have rights. In wrapping up, we seem ambivalent now more than ever about the idea of a decolonial gender justice, about wanting what Jackie Alexander calls a loving freedom that responds to our dispossession but resists righteousness, that is rooting our self-determination but also our self-accountability. All is not lost. As I hear the Caribbean Court of Justice in 2018 offer its own hope for decolonial gender justice in the McEwen case, which many of us were involved in, invalidated an 1893 law in Guyana that made it an offense for a male to be dressed in female attire for an improper purpose. The president of the CCJ, and he referred to the influence of the 70s a few days ago in another lecture, said difference is as natural as breathing. Infinite varieties of everything exist under the sun. Civilized society has a duty to accommodate suitably differences among human beings. Only in this manner can we give due regard to everyone's humanity. He linked gender equality to self-determination and the realization of the full potential of everyone. He quoted his colleague, Justice Jamadar, that inequality and discrimination undermine not only the dignity of persons, but it severely fractures peace, it erodes freedom. And he called what I think Jackie Alexander would call for, which is a loving freedom.
Thank you very much for ending on that philosophical note. And our time is contracted, but I do want to put the women in conversation with each other, particularly around these ideas of freedom and equality, and the question of how, in fact, change is produced. There is, when we look at the context of the 1970s, not just agitation, but also a legislative agenda about how people's lives can be, or their struggles can be alleviated. We hear from Khadija a bit of the context of rural women. She uses language like, these rural women are progressive. I'm interested to know, what does that mean in reality when we say things like, we are empowering women? What does that mean in reality in terms of the agendas of the present, and whether the specifics of the women on the sugar estate who are thinking about things like equality with men is not a limiting frame? That certainly when we think about the 1970s, the idea is not necessarily an equality that reduces us to the conditions that are existing in the moment in time. And so their agendas were significantly also anti-imperial. Their agendas were about restructuring the social order more fully. They are thinking through a kind of transformative logic that says, how can we create a better society? So I just want to ask the three presenters if you could think through those particular things in terms of what you see as the demands of our time. I know Tracy gave us a lot, but to think about the demands of our time, meaning our present, in terms of this idea of how gender justice and decolonization come together, and what specific changes it is that we would want to see. I don't know if this mic can actually move, so maybe we don't have to get up. Can I do that? Peggy, if we can start with you. Is she hearing? Is she with us? I'm not sure she's still with us, but so let's start. Okay, she is.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. The question is, how does the justice and decolonization come together? I think that one of the things that we really are missing now is more attention to feminist economy, to really understand how those things come together. I would like to suggest that we go back to some things that I learned in 1984. The heads of government, of CARICOM governments, signed a document in 1984, the Nassau Understanding, that recognized structural adjustment as the framework, the foundation for Caribbean development. Now, that policy framework is actually the foundation of the neoliberal economic policies that we see today. And in fact, it is a neo-colonial policy framework. It's a policy framework that condemns our countries to the dependency that we experienced under colonialism. And I think not enough attention is paid to that today. I feel very handicapped in the fact that I wasn't able to listen to the presenters of the conference, and so maybe that was talked about. But in terms of gender justice, I want to draw attention to the feminist critique of that policy framework. And in fact, it is picking up on, Honor referred to the fact that Joan French and Lynette Vassar were both using that kind of intersectional analysis long before people used that term, intersectional analysis. I came in contact with that kind of analysis at the first meeting I had with those feminists from the South, the feminists with very strong roots in the decolonization and the non-aligned movements. And they pointed to the fact that that particular policy framework disproportionately affected women, because a disproportionate number of women lost jobs when governments cut their budgets in health and education. All women lost services that are essential for our work in the household, caring for our families, our work in social reproduction, that is, services like water and sanitation, education, and health. And in addition to those two um, things that we experience as women, losing jobs and losing services, it's women that had to fill those gaps created by those services. Now, that kind of critique is only possible if you recognize that link between production and social reproduction, which is recognized by the sugar workers in that clip that we saw. And I think that we need to come back to integrate some of that understanding of the political economy of colonization and neocolonialism in the work that we are in our advocacy at this time.
Thank you for that, Peggy. You can also think about what she's saying in responding.
Right. Okay, so thank you. So first of all, I think I would want it to be very clear, progressive in the sense of not discrediting all the hard work of the progressive women of the 40s, of which my mother, for example, is from, and the 30s and going back. It's progressive in the sense that we are thinking contemporary, what is happening in the global space. We are placing our women in positions where they can influence some decisions, for example, the higher level meetings, going to Rome to sit with people who are telling us what we need to do in the Caribbean, getting our young people at the tables and youth fora. So when we talk about progressive, we talk about using education as one of the key vehicles to change mindsets. To change mindsets so that there is less dependence, there is more self-sustenance, self-efficacy, self-reliance, as a buzzword we're using today. So education, that is at the forefront of what the network believes in. So partnering with persons to help us to bring certain information to the rural communities, whether it's through the Bureau of Gender Affairs, whether it's through our UN Women partners. We strongly believe that we first need to start with education. The research shows us about the illiteracy rates of our rural people. We want to counteract that. We understand the need to foster education. So through programs with the youth at the 4-H club, whether it's the school I mentioned, through exposing young people to university courses, college courses, we believe that we can help to switch mindsets. That's the progression and the progressiveness that we're speaking about. What's going on in the global space? We can tell you that it's for the first time some of our rural women, we have been helping them to get passports so that they can leave the country, go sit on various committees, represent the network. It's no longer just the board of the JNRWP that is representing. There is exposure so that they can get into the larger conversations. So at a very practical level, when we talk progress, and progressiveness, we're talking about exposure, education. We underscore that. We do quite a bit of workshops, seminars, working with our young people in schools, so that we can, as I said in the beginning, try to shift mindsets about agriculture and not just being, like our last study of the GBV showed us how much reliance on the men in the family to bring money. We're helping our women to understand, empower yourself through education So you don't have to sit down home and wait for money. Start a little chicken coop for poultry farming. Start cabbage farming. Start doing something where you can make some money and feel empowered to do things. So you don't need to be there and being taken advantage of. Right? So I want to hand over to you. Yeah.
You know, one of the things that Tracy mentions is the, interpersonal quarrels that occur between men and women in the family court. And you speak to structural impediments to women's progress. We can't conceive of a sugar worker outside of the political economy, the global political economy. And the idea then that, as you point out, women are dependent on remittances to subsidize their work on the farm. When we think about these issues, the structural impediments to progress, and then even when people have the means to so-called, empower themselves, conflict remains in the relations that exist within our society. It brings us to, I think, back to what Peggy is saying in terms of how we understand these issues and the levels of struggles that have to be undertaken in order to arrive at that position of decolonization. And then, again, back to the question, how exactly do we produce change?
I think, Mazik, if you don't mind, if I come back to one of your earlier comments about equality as a limiting frame, and to ask what is its ability to produce change, and to agree that some of the ways in which we have articulated it do generate and produce and further entrench inequality and gender inequalities. I think of the Property Rights of Spouses Act, which took, I think, 3 decades to introduce. It starts from the position that spouses share something called a family home equally. Spouses include a man and a woman who have lived together for 5 years. But if relations of gender are unequal, inside those relationships, half and half may not be fair. And so, interestingly, other parts of the Caribbean, the starting point is that relations of intimacy are gendered and often unequal, and that the law's job is to address the inequality. Our starting point is that there's equality in a spousal relationship. And I think in that context, we find increasingly women who are on the margins of law, who have to bargain. And I offer the word bargain in a pejorative sense, because you have to bargain through your inequality in the frame of modern law reform and modern law making. So I think there are some difficult ways in which we come to understand what equality can mean. But I think the other point, which is extremely important for me, is that we have become a society invested in inequality. We have given it considerable purchase. We have entrenched it in our constitutional frameworks, and we continue to say to some of us, you are nobody. You are outsiders, you don't belong here. And I think that's a deeply troubling development of, I would say, this millennium, increasingly, and the way in which it relies on the colonial frame for its anchoring is disturbing, and we should disavow it.
I actually think that's a great point for us to continue to consider, but also probably the place that we have to end, because we go live in 15 minutes, and I think that some work has to be done in order to make that happen. So I appreciate the panelists. I'm sure our audience also appreciates what you have left us with today, and thank you once again to the work of Lynette Vassell, Joan French, and Beverly Manley Duncan, and Honor Ford Smith as well, Peggy, who is online, and the many other people who would have been involved in creating the dynamics that occurred in the 1970s and that we are talking about. I know there is the Manley of the 1980s, but clearly this is what has energized us, certainly for most of today. Okay, thank you.
self-defined political roundtable. I'm not quite sure what that means, but we'll go with that title. I'll introduce our two guests, say a couple comments, and we'll get into it. To my far right, no politics in that, is the Honorable Bruce Golding, the 8th Prime Minister of Jamaica, who served from 2007 to 2011. Leader of the JLP, Jamaica Labour Party, from 2005 to 2011. Leader of the opposition from 2005 to 2007. MP for West Kingston from 2005 to 2011. Former leader of the National Democratic Movement, and also Member of Parliament for West St. Catherine and Central St. Catherine, and definitely not at the same time, but different times. Beside me is Dr. the Honorable Peter Phillips, former President of the People's National Party, former Leader of the Opposition, Minister of Finance and Planning 2012 to 2016, and Member of Parliament for East Central St. Andrew. And I should add, former member of the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of the West Indies. There was a comment that was made at the panel last night about North Street and one college on one side of the street and another college on the other, and a rivalry between them. Well, today we have a different kind of representation in that all three persons on this panel went to the college on Hope Road. Notice I said the college on Hope Road, despite there being others on that same road. But although one of us did also go to St. George's College, to his merit, I would not be able to say, but he certainly went to St. George's. There is something about Jamaica College that needs to be said in light of this reality, and it is Michael Manley's college, it was Norman Manley's college, it was Stuart Hall's college. It has a whole generation of a younger stream, perhaps Peter Phillips, Richard Bernal, Charles Mills, Charles Carnegie, who many people may not know, but is an eminent part of that school of contemporary thinkers, and David Scott. So there's a whole, all of the major colleges in the corporate area can speak of their intellectual traditions. Calabar, Rupert is here somewhere, Scree Bertram, KC, Orlando Patterson, St. George's, Barry Shivans, Tony Bogues, and others here. But there's a particular stream out of Jamaica College, which I think we need to recognize. And also in the recognition of these streams, we're talking about boys' schools, right? And so it speaks to the nature of the intellectual production of the 20th century and how it was, you know, girls are doing all fantastic things in different places. But there's this particular stream which speaks to gender, which in the light of our last panel we should consider. Work needs to be done on it, but when you have a school that can produce in a very short space of time a Michael Manley, a Stuart Hall, and a Charles Mills, many people don't understand the extent to which Charles is held in the highest regard in international philosophical circles. We need to think about sociologically about what that means. We have 2 hours to hold your attention tonight, and so I want us to begin with a general question that I'm going to throw to our panelists, reflecting basically on their memory experiences, anecdotes perhaps, with Michael Manley. And I'm going to ask Bruce Golding to start, and then Peter Phillips to follow. Bruce, over to you. Yes. I want you to start, If you wish. If you wish. Absolutely.
Yeah, more comfortable.
Absolutely.
Can they sit here?
Okay, I'm going to give you mine.
Huh?
He would prefer not to hold it in his hand, so let's see if it can work. And if it doesn't, we'll use that.
Forgive me, I cannot drag myself to be here. I'm having some back problems and I'm on some painkillers and they tend to make me nauseous. So, bear with me. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
You know, when Tony Bogue called me and invited me to be here, I reflected for a moment that despite our shortcomings, and we're not short of them, how far we have come. Because in the early dispensation of my political journey, I doubt that such an invitation would have been extended. And if it were, I would have asked myself, what would I be doing there? And you know, sadly, there are a few people I know today who will perhaps be more expressive. What the expletive was he doing there? So we still have a journey to go. There's hardly any politician, any political leader in the last 50 plus years that has had a greater impact on Jamaica than Michael Manley. Indeed, that impact wasn't confined to Jamaica, it was all over the Caribbean, and indeed, quite significantly on the international stage. And I don't think there is any other Jamaican political leader whose legacy has commanded as much reflection and review as Michael's. And therefore I think what we are having now, started yesterday and will continue tomorrow, is a useful conversation to reflect on that impact, that legacy. Was it positive or negative? Did it move Jamaica forward or set Jamaica back? The jury on that question is out and is not likely ever to return. But you know, part of the difficulty when we assess the contribution of political leaders is that we think and we comment in dichotomous terms. The person was either a hero or a villain. Was either a great leader or a colossal failure. Michael Manley's legacy has not been spared that ring of fire. And you know, that inclination is particularly true of those of us to whom Michael Manley was an adversary. There's an instinctive unwillingness, not an inability, but an instinctive unwillingness to analyze, to try to understand things, even if you disagree with the things that you understand, before rendering your verdict. Be as sharp in your criticism as you think is appropriate. And if your understanding leads you to that conclusion, But intellectual integrity demands that you understand what you're criticizing. A more purposeful analysis is how much of Michael Manley's impact was positive and how much was negative. Because perfection doesn't reside in any of us. I think Michael Manley's legacy must also be viewed in the context of the times in which he lived, because we are defined by our times. And in the context of the prism through which he saw Jamaica and the world, the conditions that existed both here and abroad, and how he sought to respond to them. He came to political prominence back in the 1960s. I think we all know that he had a dynamite of a presence and an engaging persona, whether he walked into a crowded room or whether he was on a political platform. He said he didn't like to be called charismatic, but that is what he was. And let me share with you two anecdotes. I remember back in, must have been 1970, 71, I was bird shooting up in Rock Hall. And at about 5 o'clock, the guy who was picking up birds for me came and said, "Boss, me have to leave you now, you know." I said, "But you can't leave, you know, the bird them just start fly." "Boss Joshua come a Sligoville, and me have to go listen to him." Now I can walk and chew gum at the same time, but I can't shoot and pick up my own birds at the same time. So I had to pack up my shotgun and head back home. And then when I was organizing West St. Catherine for my first election, back in 71 must have been. At that time Michael was all over the island. He was touring constituencies like crazy. And he had his eyes set on mine. And I think he must have toured it 2 or 3 times. Day-long tours ending up with big meetings. And every time he came into that constituency, I spent the next 2 weeks trying to cauterize the damage that he had done. He had a hell of an effect. But you know, if one takes the trouble to read his writings, Politics of Change, Up the Down Escalator, Voice at the Workplace, Struggle in the Periphery, The Poverty of Nations, one begins to understand his thought processes. And I will tell you quite candidly, it's hard to fault his analysis. He emerged as a political force in the 1960s during the second decade of our pursuit of the Arthur Lewis model, the import substitution model. And that model produced unprecedented growth. We were averaging 7% growth a year. Can you imagine what 7% growth a year today would mean? But that growth masked the underlying social and economic problems that the masses were experiencing. Both the masses in the rural areas and those who were lured to the urban centers by that very model. And they were caught, they were trapped in stubborn poverty, exacerbated by the beginning of the collapse of our agricultural export sector, sugar and bananas, that had underpinned the economy of vast sections of rural Jamaica. Added to that was the fact that they were exposed to socio-cultural victimization inherent in our laws, in our institutions, in our values. And there was, as Manley identified, a deficit in social justice. Michael Manley weaved those two elements into his own theory of cause and effect. He didn't see the dilemma that Jamaicans were in. He did not see that in parochial terms. The effect was local. The cause was far beyond our shores. And hence his conclusion that Jamaica could not be the sole focus of change, but that if Jamaica and other countries similar to Jamaica were to change in helpful ways, the international environment and the international structures had to change. The worst effect of the market, he contended, was what he called the provocative extremities of wealth and power. That the market not only accommodated, but in fact nourished. He also took a historical perspective. To Michael Manley, political independence didn't bring the curtain down on colonialism any more than the abolition of slavery brought the curtain down on the exploitation of black people. That drove the socio-cultural dimension of his mission. So say what you want about Michael Manley. One thing you can never say is that he was a rebel without a cause. He was very clear in his own mind as to what his cause was. Now, if one were to accept Manley's theoretical analysis, the question that is asked is, what went wrong? Where did he go wrong? You know, I've heard a comparison made so often. I may even have made it myself. About, and it's an oversimplified comparison, between Jamaica and Singapore in the 1960s. They were both pursuing the same labor-intensive import substitution screwdriver industries. Singapore transitioned from labor-intensive to skill-intensive, to capital-intensive, to technology-intensive, and now innovation-intensive. And, you know, many make the declaration that if Michael Manley had not disrupted that path with his democratic socialism, Jamaica would be right up there with Singapore. And therefore, even in his grave, there are many who blame him for Jamaica's lack of growth and development. One never knows. History never discloses its alternatives. Certainly, the kind of restrictions in civil liberties, for example, trade union activity, that Lee Kuan Yew imposed, and which was an integral part of his strategy, is something that would never find acceptance in Michael Manley's thinking. Another major difference is that Lee Kuan Yew, unlike Manley, didn't seek to take on the world economic order, and therefore didn't annoy the powerful international forces. What he did, he focused on transforming Singapore to take advantage of the international order as it existed in the best way that he could. And kudos to him. I mean, he has secured his piece of the pie. There's no question that the 1970s under Michael Manley resulted in major economic setback. During his year, the economy declined by almost 25% in the 70s, leading up to 80. And there are other contributing factors. Let us acknowledge that. I mean, the oil price jolt, the fall in bauxite prices, and so on. But there's no question that many things went awry, that contributions to that devastating outcome came from the policies that were pursued, well-intentioned though they may have been, and the posture that was adopted, seeking to take control of the commanding heights of the economy, proclaiming that those who disagreed with his policies could take one of the 5 flights to Mad, committing to walk hand in hand to the mountaintop with Fidel Castro. You know, those things may have been okay if you had massive oil reserves or gold, and the state would therefore be able to provide the capital to drive investment in the country. But if you're depending on owners of capital to do it, that's not the way to seduce them. And they were not amused. But you know, let's recognize that in interviews that he has done, and I remember listening to a series of interviews that Faye Ellington conducted of him, he acknowledged where he may have gone wrong. And that's significant, you know, because not many political leaders, even when they're about to go to their graves, are prepared to say, look, I made a mistake. And to Michael Manley's credit, he has acknowledged. I mean, he said, for example, that he seriously overestimated the capacity of the state. He thought the state would have been able to play a role, significant role in his scheme of things. But he had overestimated what the state could do. He went further. He said he overestimated the level of political consciousness of the people. So when he was marching on his journey, and he believed that the people were behind him, when he turned around and saw that the crowd was getting scanty, he said he overestimated their political consciousness, despite the fact that he was so persuasive, and despite the fact that he himself had done so much to raise that consciousness. He admitted, for example, that the foreign exchange liberalization when he returned to power in 1989, that it was premature. I was in the House at the time. I got a sense, but I don't have the facts. Peter perhaps would know. I got a sense that he was seeking to affirm his new commitment to a market economy, and hoping perhaps that Washington was paying attention. That's my view. But he admitted in that interview that it was premature. He used an analogy, you know, he said it's like coming out of a Volkswagen and going into a Formula One car without having prepared yourself for the speed at which it is going to be traveling. I can only speculate as to the extent to which the policy choices that he made in the 1970s were shaped by the influence that Harold Lasky may have had on him. And he has acknowledged that he was influenced by Lasky. Would it have made any difference if Michael Manley had been less combative, less confrontational? Would he have been more successful if he had, instead of clothing this thing in an ideology that many people found scary, would he have been more successful if he had to use a Jamaican term, walk quietly and carry a big stick? Again, no one will ever know. His endeavor to create a new international economic order fizzled, and he acknowledges, I mean, in his retirement, in some of the interviews that I listened to. The socialism of the 1980s, well, up to the 1980s, which was part of that new international world order constellation, that receded. Communism was significantly degraded. There are only 4 countries in the world now that still proclaim themselves to be communist. the institutional architecture that he identified as a major hindrance to development for countries like Jamaica, that has largely survived with some incremental adjustments that are perhaps too insignificant to provide a meaningful pathway for developing countries. The world made a dramatic turn to the right or to right of center. Even that, you know, is now changing under the guise of it's an insularity parading as nationalism. And that is now flourishing across all continents. To each his own, one may say. Globalization, which was promoted as the level playing field that would allow countries like Jamaica to, not without some painful adjustments, but would allow countries like Jamaica to begin to get ahead. That now seems to be at risk. Autocratic regimes are now enjoying great popularity in South America, in Europe. I don't fully understand it. It's a mix-up business. I would love to know what Michael Manley would have thought and whether his vision of a new economic order is dead for all times. A few more points I want to make. The world today is more interwoven than when Michael Manley sought to redo its architecture. Tony Bogues made a very interesting point recently at the Michael Manley related function at LSE, no? He made a very important point that climate change, which is the most serious existential threat that faces us. That is very much tied up with the whole concept of the world order. Because despite our efforts, we are now at COP 29. When I was in office, I was dealing with COP 16. And the developing countries have not been able to persuade the industrial emissions guzzlers that they're destroying the world. I remember the Prime Minister, the President of Maldives, making the point. That time we were arguing with them about trying to limit rise in sea level to 1.5 inches. And he said, if it gets to 1.25 inches, half of my country is underwater. But the international order doesn't seem to be concerned. I mean, half of America is not going to be underwater, or half of India, or China, for that matter. Michael Manley returned to power in 1989 as a different Manley. Seems to me that he recognized the resilience, if not the imperviousness, of the established economic order. And he changed course. Was it a surrender, or merely a political strategy to regain state power? Or was it a recognition that he had to pursue another path to achieve even some of the objectives to which he had dedicated himself? I don't believe for one moment that Michael Manley resiled from the principles that he espoused in the 70s, principles of social justice, economic empowerment, expanding opportunities for poor people, undergirding the dignity and the self-worth of every Jamaican. I believe that he opted for pragmatism, mindful of the fact that he had a limited time in which to try to secure even some of his objectives. No one, knows how his pursuit of those objectives would have fared if he had not had to retire. Was Michael Manley like they say in the Panasonic ad, Was Michael Manley ahead of his time? No more than 50 years since Michael roamed the land. The world is moving further and further away from the transformation that he was trying to bring about. You realize that the top 10% of the world's population controls 76% of the world's wealth and earns 52% of the world's income. The bottom half, the bottom 50%, owns only 2% of the world's wealth and earns 8.5% of the world's income. Talk about going up the down escalator. Does it mean that we must resign ourselves to that reality or find new ways to correct it? I said before that it's difficult to fault Michael's analysis. His analysis of Jamaica's situation, his analysis of its external antecedents. And that is what I think keeps that jury out. The problematic assessment of how he proceeded to implement, how he proceeded to bring about the change that he saw as necessary. Some might say he was spot on in his diagnosis, but wrong in his prescription. Whatever may be our criticism of his time, Michael Manley's contribution to social upliftment cannot be overlooked or trivialized. He sought to tear down some of the formalized prejudices that the masses of the people faced on a daily basis. He sought to expand opportunities for poor people, although I believe that some of his efforts should have been better planned and better executed. I'll give you an example. A big thing for him was expanding access to secondary schools for poor people. And that is noble. But what happened? Between 1974 and 1980, high school enrollment increased by 75%, thanks to Michael Manley. Enrollment in teachers' colleges increased by 11%. So we ended up with unworkable teacher to pupil ratio. So the idea was good, but then if you're going to implement it, you have to make sure if you're going to put so many children in schools, you have to make sure that you have the teachers there to support them. Michael Manley once made an interesting comment. I found it very interesting, and it caused me to think. He was being interviewed by Donette Chinloy, and he sought to draw a distinction between political thinkers, and he named Marx and John Stuart Mills and Keynes. He sought to draw a distinction between political thinkers and thinking politicians. Political thinkers, he said, were those who reflected, analyzed, conceptualized, and developed ideas. Thinking politicians were those who picked up those ideas, adapted them where necessary, and go on to implement them. And I keep pondering to myself, in which of those two categories should Michael Manley be located? Thank you very much.
I think we're reverting to a stand-up format. I had expected Bruce to make some anecdotal comments, but he has given us a tremendous amount of material to chew on and think about. And I'm not going to try to make any of my own responses, of which I have quite a few, but I'm just a chair. I'm going to allow Peter, however, if he wishes to give a more expansive presentation of his own, and then we can take it up from there with questions that we share with each other.
Good afternoon, everyone. I definitely need to stand up also to adjust in a sense some of the remarks that some of the remarks that I had planned to make. I suppose I would begin with something I recall that Karl Marx said. Men make their own history, but not in the way that they would choose. And I think we need to take into consideration that Michael Manley emerged as an expression of his times in Jamaica. And it was a very unique time in many respects. It's true that, Michael's political career is certainly the focus of much controversy. Yet, it is also true that regularly, 52 years after his first assumption of office as Prime Minister, he remains arguably the most popular Prime Minister in the history of the country. Popularity, as they say, is notoriously fickle. But I believe it is also true to say that quite apart from being the most popular persons to have occupied the office, that Michael is perhaps, more than perhaps, I believe the most consequential Prime Minister that Jamaica has had, in the sense that his impact on the society, for good or ill, however you judge it, was the most profound impact that anyone has had. He is still the focus of the divide in the country's opinions. Half the country says the dark days of the 1970s account for all ill. And another part of the country traces whatever light, whatever glimmer of light that ordinary Jamaicans feel that history has bestowed upon them to date from Michael's time in office, by which they mean mainly the 1970s. All told, for me, it wasn't the popularity or the controversy surrounding his administration, particularly his first, that defined the phenomenal and transcendental quality of Michael Manley's impact on Jamaica's society and politics. Rather, for me, simply put, and I've said it before and I say it again, I believe that Michael Manley's administrations of the 1970s in particular irrevocably demolished the social, if not the economic foundations of colonial Jamaica and ushered in a new era in our history. If we were a back door, front door society up to that time, and well, I don't know, I guess everybody here, I look over there, I think everybody here is as gray as I am, but maybe there are some who don't know. But Jamaica's society of the 50s, 60s that I grew up knowing was a place where one class of people were told to go in middle class circles to the back door. You just turn up, you know which door you go to, and other people come to the front door. Michael Manley erased that condition out of Jamaica's society. Yet, I don't think we should put too much of the weight of doing it on Michael himself. I think there are three essential factors that need to be taken into account in trying to understand the impetus that underlay what was accomplished. First was the party, the People's National Party. And much of, in fact, almost the entirety of what was done was the result of much pondering, much debate, much internal debate that was to take place inside of the party. It is true that the even going the most recent, before the 1972 assumption of office, which was the plan of the Economic Policy Committee that Michael was a member of, a lot of people from the Young Socialist League core, and David Core that is, and Michael were perhaps the most centrist, or one might say conservative, members of that committee. You had other people like Small, Monroe, that is as in Trevor, who were members of that Economic Policy Committee of 1965. And that committee was recommending, among other things, the establishment of a national commercial bank. But its most radical proposals, which were not all carried into the party program, was for a limitation on the size of all land holdings. And it was proposed, what came out was a proposal for 500 acres to be the upper limit on land holdings. But what was proposed was 50 acres inside of the party councils at the time, which was deemed, mainly on the basis of the arguments from Core and Manley, as being probably too radical for the country electorate to accept. But the general point I want to make here is that there had been 20, 30 years of deep consideration inside of the party about the nature of the transformation that was required to eliminate the social and structural inheritances of colonialism. And to a considerable degree, what Michael was to bring into being in the 1970s was the result of the party considerations. The second factor that I think we ought to take into account is the social movement of which the party was an element, but which extended beyond the party. You know, in the session this morning that I passed through here, for one of the things that I recalled was that the Rodney upheaval was in fact predated Michael's. Michael was not even leader of the opposition at the point in time. Yet there was a whole mobilization of students around Rodney's exclusion, around the Black Power ideal and idea, and that Rodney himself had been very much involved, and some of us with him, all across the city and the country, speaking about a different social order that was necessary if independence was to mean anything. By way of anecdote, I remember October 15th being in a gathering to show how wide-ranging the social movement was, with Gonzales, Golden, Scree Bertram, myself, Jerry Small, and others down at Bryce Hill Drive, really thinking about what would likely emerge the morning after. I mention it because at that point in time, Bruce, who was definitely committed to the Labour Party, but was willing, prepared, and sitting with us and sharing the same orientation of building some better place, making representations as best he could for reason to be exercised on the part of the government. And I mention it because one of the issues for further deliberation, really, and this is something that we need to look at as the 70s transpired and later, is the extent to which this broad-based social movement that existed through the 60s became fractured as we proceeded in time. Because, and put it plainly, I think one of the issues that we collectively need to confront is the extent of what is widely known as political tribalism, which has divided almost every initiative for popular and national progress in the country. Because, and it is an inheritance from somewhere, but where from, I think, needs a lot of the analysis. I'll say something more later. But remember those 60s. 62, we proclaim independence. I remember, August 6th, my father and the family of which I was a part were coming from England, where he had gone to do his PhD, and left me in New York because there was only 2 seats on the plane coming, and he was going to come back to Jamaica to be in the National Stadium when the Jamaican flag of independence was raised. And he was one of a whole generation who were invested in this independence event. By 65, there were the so-called Chinese riots. Millard Johnson ran a kind of black power political excursion in 67, I believe it was, as part of it, but reflecting what was still a Garveyite strand in the national consciousness. By the time we reached 68, there was the Rodney riots, of which we were all a part. Michael Manley comes to office 69 on the wave of both the party's internal deliberations and the wave of this social movement which had given rise not just to Black Power, but the New World Group, the dependency analysis of the Jamaican economic reality. And that was what was carried into office by the PNP in 1972. Now, the third element, I think, in understanding Michael, which we must take into account, is not so much, his charisma, as has been said, he disliked the term, but I think we cannot deny that he had a tremendous will to get things done, almost a kind of determination that would permit no obstacle in the way of doing the things that he felt were essential to be done. That meant, in effect, in relation to much of the policies then, such as free education, and in the 73 announcement, and some of the others which perhaps did not, would have warranted more careful managerial style, approach to their implementation. But he had the determination to seize the moment in these things. And one of the factors that we need to bear in mind in all of this was that the oil price shock of 1973 was not anticipated by him, by the PNP, in fact by anyone. And there were errors, particularly as far as fiscal management was concerned, but which were not anticipated by this steady increase in the oil price, consequent really on America deciding to abandon the fixed exchange rate for the dollar in the Nixon surprise, so-called, of 73. That by the mid-80s, the South, the global South, had built up an unsustainable debt. We had also. Mexican debt crisis came in early 80s, 82, 83. The United States, because of the proximity of Mexico, Mexicans have always said their problem in life is that they're too far from God and too close to the United States. The United States saw the need to bail Mexico out of its particular debt crisis. That was the Brady bonds were formed to deliver that. But there being no option, we had the working out of that particular circumstance in the IMF and the Emergency Production Plan issue in Jamaica, where quite frankly, the only source of dollars that would allow the country to survive was going to come through the IMF. And it was an IMF that had a particularly jaundiced view about the value of social programs. And I dare say an IMF which was determined to teach Jamaica a lesson, quote unquote, at that point in time. We have had a long history since then with the International Monetary Fund as a country. A second, quite apart from not being able to anticipate what was happening, what was likely to happen in economic terms at that point in time, was a belief inherited in part, although there are others who may have studied the issue more than I, but inherited a commitment to a democratic principle and tradition, which may have been inherited from Lasky's lectures, but which made Michael have more hope for a dialogue to resolve questions, even at the level of the international community and the discussions about the new international economic order, than was warranted by the realities of great power politics and Cold War politics in particular. I don't think Michael grasped in the early 70s, the degree to which the issue of Cuba was going to affect the U.S. disposition toward Jamaica. It wasn't so much Cuba itself, because the truth is, in the most fiery time of the relationship with the Cubans and the relationship between the United States and Cuba, when the Cubans intervened in Angola, the aircraft leaving with Cuban troops from Havana refueled in Barbados, not Jamaica. They couldn't do it without Barbados support. But the U.S. didn't try to overthrow the Barbadian government. What they were most concerned about was the closeness between the People's National Party and the Communist Party of Cuba at the time. And that is what necessitated, in the view of the United States government, in my opinion, this is the kind of work of the historians in the Department of History and Government at UWI to do. But it was that political relationship between the parties that caused Kissinger to come and to speak his mind here. Now, the 1980s was a time of great reflection. And I think more striking for Manley was the realization. I think there was a conference, Tony, you might recall, but in Mexico, there was a conference in Mexico, Reagan, Thatcher, and the G7, or one of them, and it was made pellucid by Reagan that all of this thing about social justice for the developing world was a no-go. It wasn't going to be, it was not going to be accommodated. And the response was really what became known as the Washington Consensus, that is, simply put, if you ran afoul of the IMF, then there were no funds to be had, no support, none from the IDB, none from the World Bank, none from the European Union, that you were on your own. And I can testify personally to the strength of the Washington Consensus in 2012 and 13, of having had funds approved, particularly by the European Union, and not being able to draw down $1 until we came to terms with an IMF which had determined, until we were able to do anything about it, which were determined that we should be taught a lesson. I won't go into the individuals involved, but thank God that global power by then included some African Americans in the Congress who were able, and that the president of the day was also somebody who could understand the predicament of a small country like ours. But that prompted a rethink. That whole episode prompted a rethink on the part of Michael. Bruce asked a question in his remarks. Did Michael abandon the objectives that he had had? And I would say, based upon my experience, absolutely not. What he sought to do, even after his retirement, and I speak now, this is your anecdotal part, Bisa. We had great discussions, and he as to how, in the context of the market and the inevitability of accommodating the market as a means of allocating economic resources, how could the agenda of social justice and social progress remain alive? He wanted to explore things as the reprogramming of the credit union movement to accomplish more, the ESOP program to accomplish what it did. Those were the issues that were uppermost in his mind. And it's one of the issues why, it's one of the factors why he sought nevertheless to maintain the South-South links with Carlos Andres Perez and others, which resulted in the Greater Portmore Project as one mechanism for addressing the social needs for housing And it was also an area where I think we see the great manifestation of will on the part of Michael. One of my early responsibilities was for that project. And in every facet of its implementation, where there were objections, Michael was prepared to use this tremendous power of his office to shake it out. If we couldn't meet the terms of importing from Venezuela the required goods as stipulated by the San Jose Accord, Michael was prepared to say, what else can we import? So if we were going to be getting buses from wherever, he said, no, we're going to do Venezuelan buses. So, and plead with the Venezuelans to accept that as part of the Venezuelan value added to make this program a reality. In much the same way, even though he was alive to the need for more careful planning and deliberate planning regarding the liberalization of the currency, I think Michael by then was in a race against time. And he had a belief that only he had the political resources at the time to be able to bring about this particular change in our situation. And to be fair, again, the judgment of history needs to be out. But we have not had a foreign exchange crisis in Jamaica since that time. Now, what we have not managed to do and what remains is how to deliver on growth, how to deliver on inclusive growth that will put more players on the field of action, more players not drawn from the traditional elites, but players drawn from other enterprising strata in the country. And this remains the challenge that we have. And I think, as I had promised to, that one of the particular issues that weighed on his mind is how can the country find common cause to implement programs that are important for national development, programs that are intrinsic to the nation-building problematic that we all face in the context of our excessively divided democratic practice in Jamaica. How do we implement something like land reform without it falling prey to exclude the labor right and only include the comrades, or vice versa? And that, I dare say, is a predicament that still weighs on us. But it is for our generation now to find the path to that salvation and to be able so that we can build on this legacy of Michael Manley, which was to rid us of the prejudices and the structures that colonialism had imposed upon us and which kept us down for so long. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks again, Bruce. As I said before, this was not how it was supposed to have gone. We were supposed to have a brief intervention, and then we would move off, and Michael with nice anecdotes and so on. Instead, we've got a really deep, thoughtful analysis of the period, obviously coming from different places, but very thoughtful. I want to try and direct us back into the conversation, and we can either come up or use the mics that we have on the floor if you wish. But to take up, first of all, Bruce on the question of tribalism that Peter raised. And more broadly speaking, on the role of party clashes that have existed since the beginning of the two-party system in Jamaica, between the unions initially and then beyond that on a wider basis, but mushrooming in the 1970s into horrendous violence. And I don't think we can even begin to understand the crisis of the 1970s, of 1980 in particular, if we don't think about the figure which is commonly used of 800 people dying in 1980. I'm not making a case here for the direction of that violence, although the work on the direction still needs to be done. But I'm asking a comment on, first of all, any insights into what happens after 1974 and really continues only gathering momentum and some slowdowns into 1980. Unless Jamaica can begin to understand that fact, then all the analysis of mistaken economic strategies and even the understanding of what happened with oil, etc., which are very real, is part of the story. But there's another half to be told. I'd love Bruce to comment on that.
I think we're very helpful to ourselves if we are just brutally frank about it. I listened to Michael Manley's interviews in retirement. The one statement that he made that upset me, because he was asked this very same question. And he said, he sought to say, well, the JLP were the aggressors. And, some of our people decided that they had to respond. That's violence to history. It's not so it goes. Both parties are equal shareholders in that enterprise. Equal shareholders. The PNP can claim, the people who were driven out of Backer Wall and ended up at Riverton City. That made Riverton City an impregnable PNP area. Why do you think Babs's constituency is so strong? Why do you think Mike Henry's constituency is so strong? The people that the JLP supported that were driven out of Southern and Southwest St. Andrew. And the refugee route was west. So some stopped off in Spanish Town, some stopped off in Old Harbour, some went down to Maypen. It's not that Babsy, for me when I was there, built that constituency. When I was in there, I used to go walk into people's houses in Winter's Pen, in Irish Pen, and I would see Clem Tavares' photograph on the wall, Wilton Hill's photograph on the wall, and that time them dead long time. That's where they came from. So the reassuring thing about it is that is now behind us. I don't say you don't have some skirmishes here and there, but political violence as a major political tool no longer exists. But that doesn't mean that political tribalism is still not there. And to underscore the point that Peter was making, it is what is going to hold us back from the kind of national collective effort that some of our formidable problems require. Let me just elaborate on that a little bit. We are now in a better fiscal place than we have been in decades. And some credit naturally has to go to Peter for that. We can now take decisions that we would not have been able to take before. We're going to have to be very strategic about those decisions. And some of those strategic decisions will flounder if they become embroiled in political controversy. I want to sharpen that point a little more. Remember, when I referred to Lee Kuan Yew, they moved from labor intensive to skill intensive. Training, education. We're not going to see any significant improvement in our growth performance. We may get up to like a 2% one year, and if we're lucky and get plenty of tourists, we may even get near to 3%. But the kind of 5 and 6% growth that we need is not going to come about until we have an educated population and a skilled workforce. To get that, you're going to have to allocate resources. Resources are not the only thing, but you're going to have to prioritize. So it may be that JUTC is going to have to do without the 100 buses that they said they need. It may be that some of the roads that we would want to fix can't fix because we have to pump more and more money into education and training. But then if the bad public transport system is going to become a priority, a political quarrel, and if the bad road is going to be something that is a big political quarrel, then any government, whether PNP or JLP, is going to do what we have tried to do all the while. Share it up, a little over here, a little over here. And when election time comes, we try and find even more to make people happy. Some tough decisions are going to have to be made. But I'm not sanguine that I caused the anger of some of my political colleagues because of some comments I made at a forum here. Donna Scott was there, I remember, about the Constitution. And I made a simple point. I said, if the JLP and the PNP, if the government and opposition can't sit down and agree on the constitutional changes, then stop wasting people's time. Because nothing can pass unless it has opposition support. So anybody who believe that you can prepare a bill and bring it to Parliament. That is how Norman Manley did lay down the thing. Him says certain things you're not going to be able to change unless the two of them can put down on the differences and get together and come to an agreement. So constitutional reform doesn't appear to me to be going anywhere. I'd be more concerned, to be honest with you, if I haven't gone through the Orlando Patterson report in minute detail, but I've read commentaries on it. It seems to me that they didn't start from scratch. They took advantage of all the Ray Davis report, and I think there was another one that was. But it seems to me that one of the things that they did was to sharpen the priorities. Say, first phase, step 1, 2, 3, deal with these. I'd love if I could hear that Andrew Holness and Mark Goling right now are sitting down somewhere, having a cup of coffee, drinking a beer, and looking at the Orlando Patterson report and saying, let's not make us find a way to run with this, because if we can't get this thing going, then all this hope that we're talking about, it can pass 100 IMF tests, but every year we're going to be quarreling about whether it's 1% growth or 1.5% growth. But how do you get that back? Leadership has demonstrated before that it can be done, I mean, look at confrontational relationship that existed between Manley and Seaga. I remember after the 76 election, Seaga wrote to Manley and laid out some proposals for electoral reform. And Manley responded and said, well, you made that a platform issue and the people have voted on it already. Argument done. And yet in 1979, they two of them, with some help from Shearer, Pattison, myself, Paul Robertson got involved. They were able to come to agreement and say, listen, we have to turn the page on this one. Is it that the book finished and we don't have no more pages that we can turn? And how do we get there? Every time I get hopeful, somebody gives me reason to get despondent. Every time I see something that says, hey, look at what is happening, somebody bring to my attention some nastiness that was posted on Instagram or something. And it just set me back. So I don't know. I spoke to PJ some time ago and I said, listen, is there anything that we can do? And his heart is willing, but he says unless, he didn't use the word invitation, but unless he says that the intervention would be welcome, it has to be welcome from both sides, then there is no point in wasting time. And he's right. So I don't give up. It's just that I had thought that since we were able to put down the political violence, why is the political tribalism so, why does it linger so long?
Yeah. I want to say something like that.
I just, this really follows from what you're saying, Bruce, but the bigger question, I mean, I hear people in this audience yesterday at the opening talking about the nation and its direction, as though there's a self-evident thing called the nation that we all accept as a basic ground rule. And then it's what you're doing for the development of the nation. This concept of Jamaica that we inherited really from the 50s, but that was consolidated when we decided not to go with federation in 61 and became independent in 62. But the question I want to put on the table is a sort of meta-theoretical question. Is there a national project in Jamaica today? Is there a project that sweeps in the overwhelming majority of this population in a belief that this is a place and a project that is worthwhile? I mean, I think of the fact that we have the 5th highest rate of emigration, that half of our people are overseas, and all the points that you have made sweep into my argument. And the question, if there's any relevance to that point, is how do we move towards reframing a project of I don't want to use the word development because it is loaded, but a project of going forward, and whether it is, that's assuming that if there is a national project, it is definitely fraught and in crisis.
Can I give you a quick response?
Sure, absolutely.
There is in fact none. I have challenged people a couple of times. I say assemble people in a room. 20 people, 40 people, 100 people. Give each of them a sheet of paper and ask them to write out what they understand to be the national goals of Jamaica. Are you going to get back a whole heap of different something, and you're going to get back, the majority is going to come back as blank paper? Because they don't know. But you can't get a national goal unless you have political collaboration. So you will always have JLP policies and PNP policies, and the JLP will say that my policy is better than theirs, and PNP is going to say the same thing. Until you get to a stage. Lee Kuan Yew didn't have that problem, you know. suppress the opposition. We don't have that privilege, if you can call it a privilege. And therefore, again, it comes down to one thing, leadership.
Part of the challenge of leadership in that regard would be to include more than the political parties in that discussion. Much has been made about, in our recent experience, about epoch and how we came to have it and how we came to make it work. And the idea came out of a dialogue, first of all, and a quite heated dialogue, but in which the trade unions on the one hand said, well, you're asking us to sacrifice again. How do we know that you're not going to just take our sacrifice and fritter it away? That's the polite way of saying what they said. And the bank said the same thing. Separate meeting. How do we know? We have gone through a debt exchange. We are asked to take a haircut. Now we hear you don't have money to pay us. Having already made the sacrifice, how you're going to guarantee that we never go this way again? And the answer, not having any alternative to give them, is just come. I'll make everything available. We have no choice. So come and see. Do anything. Talk. Say what you want about what we're doing, good or bad. No. So the first thing we have to do, the leadership, the political leadership of the country needs to stop being reluctant to include the majority of the people in the dialogue with them. You don't have to like what people are saying, you just have to be prepared to talk to them in an honest way and to find our way through our present predicament. The second point I'd make in pursuit of the same objective is this. There is, and in a way, I guess maybe Michael's, willfulness, if that's the proper word, would be helpful here. Because we haven't really, the country, in the 62, however many years it is now, haven't really given the ordinary Jamaican a lot to celebrate in respect of the so-called nationhood project that we have embarked upon. One of the things I have always felt that we have been too reticent about is land reform, for example. How can we have 700,000 Jamaicans, according to Ministry of Housing, living in so-called squatter communities? And we have government have all of this land that is there that we can create opportunities to give people some of that land. As you sit down in Lilliput, as you sit down in Lesser Portmore and other places, once people get their hand on some land with basic infrastructure, they build their own housing. And so while I am very much supportive of reparations and all the demands that we're making to people overseas, I think we can do a little bit of the reparations right here in Jamaica and make the Jamaican people get a little piece of the birthright that they fought for over all of these years in simple things like land reform, for example. the majority of the farmers who till the land don't have no title to it. Why? It's not so hard. When I look at the LAMP program, I did a calculation on the average amount of titles being given out by LAMP. I think it would be about 200 years before we managed going at that rate to deliver anything, by which time everybody either kill off everybody else or migrate. You know, I think we can do much more, but we have to, the political, and this is probably one of the great contributions of Michael, not sufficiently embraced, was his enunciation of his beliefs in the politics of participation. We don't need to be afraid of engaging the population in the dialogue. And that's what's wrong with the constitutional reform, one of the things, dynamic that is going on here. It is really not something that is engaging a very wide set of people, because it's as if we have determined, it's like I used to try and work out the maths problem, look up the answer first, and then see if I could work it back. Never work.
Well, I can only agree with you on the land question, and my 2008 book makes that point, but the political people don't read the work the academics do. So I don't know if you saw it, but it's there. We want some questions from the audience, hopefully, but I want to, pardon me? You have to leave right now? Can you take one question? Okay. We can't allow the Trump world, which is descending on us in January, to escape our attention. Bruce, you in fact raised some of the questions related to the tendency in Trump. We don't know what's going to happen on January the 20th, but the question of autarky, the return of closed borders, the Washington consensus is in danger, which is a good thing on the one hand, but it's in danger from the perspective of a government which wants to shut down a certain kind of free trade, which wants to send back people to this country and to the entire region, which if this happens would destabilize us completely. The question I just want to put on the agenda is, how do you both see what is about to happen when the new extreme right-wing government comes to power in the United States fully, and how do we respond to it in the light of everything we've been saying this evening?
Put up your supper before the dog get to it. We're in for a rough ride. Rough ride. I don't think you're going to get much accommodation from that administration. What they're going to seek to do, as Trump has sought to do before, he's going to seek to pick off Caribbean countries. You know, identify which ones he wants to deal with and which ones he's going to isolate. I think our best strategy is going to be, yeah, sure, use all the diplomatic tools that we have, no? But I'm getting a sense that I'm part of the eminent persons group working with the Haitian problem. And already the kind of signals we are getting from Washington is that the disposition towards Haiti is going to change radically after January. And we have been saying to the guys over there, hurry and get your act together, because come January 20th, you know, you're looking at a new ball game. I think what we could usefully do is strengthen our links with Congress, because the House of Representatives is so closely balanced, even though the Republicans have a slight advantage, that there may be some muscle there if they can persuade a half a dozen Republicans to back them on a particular issue. But we're probably going to have to rely on congressional support to fight some of the battles that are coming. But prepare yourselves. A lot of Jamaicans are going to be forced to return home.
Yeah. Yes, I think that you know, it's the obvious thing. Though I believe myself that they're going to find that the world is much less malleable than they believe it is. The world has changed in the last 4 years. Even today, and China's actions yesterday are showing that, you know, it's more than one hand can clap in this ball game. Mixed metaphor, but you know what I mean. But that definitely there is scope for diplomatic effort, and we're going to have to recognize that despite the other power centers in the world, our situation is particularly fragile because of our proximity to the United States and all the linkages that we have had over time, people linkages and trade linkages, etc. But maybe these are the seeds of a crisis that might offer us the opportunities to go through a new and more vibrant phase of nation building for ourselves.
Thank you, Honorable Bruce Golding. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you very much. And take care. Thanks for the thoughtful comments. It's good. Okay. Yeah. We have maybe 20 minutes for comments from the floor, please. Any and all. I think, do they have mics? Can somebody actually help us passing mics? Lynette Vassell. And there's a loose mic there? Yes, there's a loose mic here. Okay, great. I think Lynette Vassell first. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to get to the point to say the point of hope that has emerged so far from this discussion is the reality that both political leaders, or the leaders of both political tribes that exist, came to a consensus that leadership is a critical issue. And I think that that gives us an excellent opportunity to say, what about leadership? What is the character of leadership that we need? What must we require from the leaders that we now have? And how can we build a consensus coming out of the energy of this conference and the example of Michael Manley to see that that grain of possibility is nurtured into something practical? I think, for example, that our leaders need to reflect on the fact of whether their leadership is deepening the decolonization process or cementing relations that are embedded in our historical realities. And be very clear, for example, that when we have parties that talk about dirty labor right or grudgeful PNP or bad mind PNP or remarks that denigrate and separate our people at base, it is carrying forward an agenda that is much very much a part of the colonial project. So I really think that we need to be very clear and we need to be very open about this question because we are tired. I mean, the sister who spoke this morning about curriculum reform, I said to her, you certainly need to go into politics. And she said, not under this divisive system. In other words, we need to find a way to reconstruct the reality of our governance and politics to enable people of goodwill who love this country, regardless of whoever, to be able to see themselves invested in it. I think all of us are very tired. I myself, as a critical supporter of the PNP, but as no card-carrying person in the PNP, definitely not on the right-wing side, I am very tired. And I want to support something, but I cannot support the foolishness that I see happening.
Well, I certainly agree 100% with what Lynette just said. You know, to go back in time with the analysis, one of the realizations that I have come to more recently is that we actually moved into independence with a too narrow a view as to what this nation building enterprise was about. The inheritance of violence as a means of dispute settlement, for example, has deep, deep, deep roots going all the way back into the enslavement and the plantation. And it lives with us to this day and has never been addressed as a cultural phenomenon which we need to almost pluck out of the being of our people, which means that you'd have to create schools with a particular orientation to almost re-socialize 300 years of inheritance as far as behaviors are concerned. Some of the attitudes towards women and the relations between man and woman, which to this day are inheritances of that same plantation, and we don't address them at all. We have, I mean, and no disrespect to anybody, but we have ministries of culture, which is about a kind of little celebration of a thing here and there, rather than a transformation of ourselves. But with respect to the political process in which I've spent probably, well, definitely more years than I have ahead of me, this impetus that we seek, my humble opinion now, we can go into the whys and wherefores, is not going to come from there. It is going to come from the people. And I have always believed, even when I was involved in the politics, which is why I believe so much in the politics of participation, that the country is too important to be just left to the politicians. It belongs to all the people, and we have to get all the people engaged in it. That's how we're going to build this new impetus.
Dr. Phillips,
yes, go ahead.
the rhetoric, which is a positive one, where I hear from you a voice and a voice of reason that is speaking more about a unified country, is related to the idea that I have about the concept of the self. Bear in mind that the epochs of slavery and colonialism characterize how we have constructed the notion of the self. And I want to link it to how, even though the rhetoric of unity and consensus is coming from you as a voice of reason, we are still divided based on the notion of attributes. We are not people, JLP people or PNP people. We are human beings, but that those attributes which seem to define who we are is still the elephant in the room that needs to be addressed. And the question is simply this: you and Bruce on opposite sides of the fence were sitting there, and in many other forums, and we see it replicated, as human beings having dialogue. Why is it impossible for us as a well-thinking people to explore and interrogate a unity system of governance for this country? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, can we have a couple more questions and then we can respond together?
Good evening.
Ilambi.
I'm a Bajan. Let me just say straight down the line. I have lived here for the last few years because I married a Jamaican woman. I want to make one very important point. I'm from the other side of the Caribbean. I'm from Barbados. And one of the things that struck me when I left Barbados to go to Canada to study, I learned from Jamaicans, from Trinidadians, from Guyanese, what the Caribbean was all about. And because I believe that it is all about, our television stations have a responsibility to show all the Caribbean territories on the television shows. I further believe that when I was a boy, I could go to the harbor and see all sorts of ships coming into the area. Where are the ships coming into the area from around the Caribbean? And it is these things that I'm saying that we need to do rather than prostrate ourselves and ignore the fact is that as a region, we have a university that is a regional university. We have a cricket team that is a universal team. We cannot even see television in Bequia or Barbados or St. Lucia or Guyana. Why not? And these are the issues I think that need to be faced. Not the ignorance of arguing in a newspaper. You have newspapers, and newspapers distribute information around the region, but yet they don't show you the details of what goes on. Nor does television, nor does the cinema, nor does the same university that exists in Jamaica and exists in Barbados and exists in Guyana and exists all around the region. So I'm saying, and I don't mean to appear to be angry, but I am angry. You understand? Because I've been living here with my Jamaican wife by choice. And what I'm saying is, we have a cricket team, we have football teams, we have all this, and yet we cannot pull ourselves together to close this region and make it an example. What is our relationship to Africa? Is it only going to be through Britain? And yet across the border from the Mediterranean right down to South Africa, on what do we do? Huh? So I am saying that this region of the Caribbean is one single region, and we should take full advantage. I am here as a Bajan living in Jamaica, but that does not mean I'm not a Caribbean man. I am. And that is why I accept that. And I recognize my family in Trinidad, my family in Guyana, which I do have. And I believe that we as a people need to change some of our... Listen, let me tell you something. When I was a boy, I used to go down to the harbor. You know why I go to the harbor? Because we had schooners coming in from all around the region. And people getting off and meeting and listening to people talk Patwa and all sorts of different accents. What has happened to that? We have airplanes that fly around the region. Huh? And what does that happen? But I can't see television in Trinidad in Jamaica or Trinidad in Barbados. I cannot see Guyana news at all in any one of the territories in the Caribbean Sea. What I'm saying is, it is time that we pull ourselves together, not we the common people, but the politicians and the leaders of the region has to take a responsibility that they are over doing the things that they need to do to pull the region together. And one of those things, the Anglican Church is linked all across the Caribbean. The Baptist Church is linked all across the Caribbean. I can't turn on my television stations, and any morning I say, you know what? I want to go and hear what's going on in Grenada. What happened in Grenada? I want to know what happened in St. Lucia. These are things that need to be done now, not to be postponed and wait for somebody to wake up in the morning with intelligence to understand that. It is something that we need to do now and stop skirting it around. Listen, when I was a boy, I used to go down to the port to watch the schooners coming in from all the islands in the Caribbean. No, you don't see that at all. The only boats we see is the boats coming from Canada or the United States or Britain.
We want to take one more question, Ilambe. So, I mean, thank you. I mean, certainly for myself, amen. I'm on the same page as you. And we need to put that in the mix of what we're doing. But there was one person with a question. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Dexra, was it you? Okay. Yeah.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
All right. So, as a student living on a campus where students aren't visible, in a region where families struggle to be seen, heard, or even to eat, in a world where we are crippled in debt, living in a post-slavery society, where there's social division, where technology distracts us, where the adults themselves seem more confused than anything. We ask ourselves, where is leadership? Now, I know we are in an academic hall and this might be taboo, but where is the respect for God? Where is the involvement of the divine in all our processes?
Thank you. I'm going to ask Peter if he has any additional comments to make. I have one, but Peter, you go ahead.
You know, I think every one of the last three comments really speaks to an essential aspect of what we're having to do. The idea of the Caribbean regional space that Elambe was pointing to is certainly something which was a vital part of the concept of who we are, that Michael embraced and that NW embraced, that the PNP as a whole embraced, and which is really obvious. You know, when although they disappointed me this last weekend, but when I see a fellow from St. Kitts turn out to bat, if he can bat, I feel total identification with him on the cricket field. I just wish he would bat for half a day more. You know? But yes, it's an essential element. And what you say, Elambe, is a vital part of what we need to do. If we're living in the information age, we better control some of the means of information for ourselves, to portray ourselves, to shape the very sensibilities that we were talking about earlier as to who we are. Because, you know, when I turn on the TV, I am caught in a vice. If I watch what is coming on the regular cable, is just killing, murder, and mayhem. And then if I say, let me watch the news, is the same thing. And quite frankly, it's very disheartening. And I think the irony is that this, what we registered as development, meaning more access to cable and all of that, is in fact really dismembering this space that we have, this Caribbean space, this national space. I agree with you about our concept of self. This is a notion of, that needs to be addressed probably from your reach to infant school. And I don't think we need to assume that it will be learned along the way. I think we need to come out and teach people. You know, after 1968 and the upheaval of those years and all the debate on black power, I couldn't believe that here now, 2024, you would be having youths bleaching, you know, to spoil their skin, to appear a different color than the one that the divine bequeathed to them. That which only tells me that we have made a lot of assumptions about what people learn and how they learn it. When I got to some stage shows in the constituency, when I was more active, I realized that, you know, the philosophy of life of the average Jamaican youth is learned from a dancehall artist. The philosophy of life of the average youth is learned from a dancehall artist. And that is who shapes their worldview as to what are the things that are important, what to believe in, what not to believe in. And that is why you can have some boys abusing girls and filming it, using media for that, because that's what they believe is important. And we are not, the thing that really concerns me is that, you know, when I graduated from this institution, some years ago, plenty years ago, I figured that we would have solved the problems that were out there as a generation. No, I think the problems that we are leaving here are worse than those that we saw then. So now, how the hell is this going to be solved? That is the question, and all I am hoping for, to come to the last comment, is that I could see the generation who is going to step up, put up their hand, and say, okay, we are going to take on this. struggle for the Caribbean peoples.
We're going to finish now. I just want to put a couple of points that have come out of the discussion on the table. Land reform as a question that can be seriously addressed. Land ownership, the abandonment of the old tribal model. It's easy words to say, maybe far more difficult to do, but putting it on the agenda is a critical question, which there is consensus on from these two leaders of the political process, because that is what they are. I heard leadership from the leadership as a question, but I also heard bottoms-up leadership. I heard from the bottom in Peter's point about bringing in people from everywhere in the society, as opposed to just the top leaders getting together and talking. And I heard that we have to, what I said, that we have to reinvent the national project. We have to reinvent a project that is meaningful, that gives us direction. And if we're going to think about that, then Ilambe's point has to be swept into it, is that what is the Jamaican project as one island in a sea, as opposed to a project that thinks about the entire region that we live in, a much broader expanse. I mean, if you want to think economically, you can think about the sea and the ownership of the sea in this broader expanse, a common ownership of the sea. And whether or not we have to think beyond the 1962 project and rethink that again. So there may be 5 or 6 things that are on the agenda, of which the philosophy that we embody is a critical part of it. So I think this has been a useful conversation. It didn't go the way I planned it to go, and it took off on its own trajectory, but I think it was very useful. I just want to say again to Tony and the entire team that brought this conference into being, in which I am a derelict member, that it's been extraordinary. And I hope it continues this way tomorrow in putting a whole lot of things on.